In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, a silver tea caddy vanishes from a locked room. Its rare Darjeeling Moonlight tea hiding a secret that could spark fortunes or ruin lives. Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and sharper mind, unravels a web of betrayal where a hidden map, a vial of mysterious seeds, and a vengeful stranger from a distant land converge. But when the thief is revealed, a shocking twist unveils a truth darker than anyone imagined. Someone in Grayson Manor isn't just hiding the caddy, they're hiding a murder. What secret is worth killing for, and who will claim it before the night is through? Chapter 1. The Curious Invitation. In the gentle hush of St. Mary Mead, where the rhythm of life flowed as predictably as the seasons, Miss Jane Marple sat in her modest drawing room, her knitting needles moving with the quiet precision of a metronome. The late afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across the polished oak floor. A cup of tea, now tepid, rested on the small table beside her, its steam long dissipated. Her hands, though aged, were deft, the needles weaving a pattern as intricate as the thoughts that occupied her mind. It was a scene of serene domesticity, yet Miss Marple's sharp blue eyes betrayed a restlessness, a flicker of curiosity that belied her tranquil surroundings. On the table, amidst a neat stack of correspondence, lay an envelope that had arrived with the morning post. It was of fine cream vellum, sealed with a wax crest that bore the initials E.G. The handwriting was elegant, almost ostentatious, with flourishes that suggested both confidence and a touch of theatricality. Miss Marple had read the letter thrice already, her lips pursing slightly each time she reached the final lines. It was an invitation from Mrs. Elspeth Grayson, a recent addition to the village's small but ever-shifting tapestry of residence. Mrs. Grayson had taken up residence at Grayson Manor, a sprawling estate on the outskirts of St. Mary Mead, and her arrival had stirred whispers among the villagers. She was, by all accounts, a woman of means and mystery, her past as opaque as the mists that clung to the manor's gardens in the early morning. The invitation requested Miss Marple's presence at a tea-tasting soirée, an event described with a certain grandeur that seemed out of place in the village's understated rhythm. The centerpiece of the evening was to be the unveiling of a rare tea blend, the Darjeeling Moonlight, a name that rolled off the tongue with an almost poetic cadence. Mrs. Grayson's letter spoke of its unparalleled flavor and enigmatic origins, phrases that struck Miss Marple as deliberately evocative. There was a hint of something more, a suggestion that the tea held a significance beyond its taste, though the letter offered no further clues. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her fingers lingering on the soft wool as she considered the matter. St. Mary Mead was no stranger to newcomers, each bringing their own stories and secrets, yet Mrs. Grayson was an anomaly. She had arrived 3 months prior, accompanied by a retinue of servants and a niece, a pale young woman named Lucy who rarely ventured into the village. The manor, long vacant since the passing of old Colonel Bantry, had been transformed under her stewardship. Its gardens bloomed with exotic flowers, and its windows gleamed with a polish that spoke of wealth. Yet the villagers knew little of Mrs. Grayson herself. Some said she was a widow, her husband a tea merchant who had met an untimely end in India. Others whispered of scandal, of fortunes won and lost in distant lands. Miss Marple, ever cautious of gossip, preferred to form her own judgments, and the invitation offered a rare opportunity to do so. She rose from her chair, her movements slow but deliberate, and crossed to the window. The village lay before her, its thatched cottages and winding lanes bathed in the golden light of autumn. Beyond the church spire, she could just make out the chimneys of Grayson Manor, half hidden by a copse of ancient oaks. The manor had always been a place of intrigue, its history woven with tales of eccentric owners and unexplained events. Miss Marple's mind drifted to the stories she had heard as a girl of hidden passages, of treasures buried in the gardens, of letters found in dusty attics that hinted at long-forgotten betrayals. She smiled faintly, dismissing such fancies. Yet the invitation in her hand felt like the opening note of a melody she could not yet name. The letter specified that the soirée would be an intimate affair, with only a select few guests. This, too, intrigued Miss Marple. In a village where gatherings were often open to all, such exclusivity suggested a purpose beyond mere hospitality. She wondered who else had been invited, and what connection they might have to the mysterious Darjeeling Moonlight. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door, and she turned to see her maid, Florence, entering with a fresh pot of tea. "Will you be needing anything else, miss?" Florence asked, her round face flushed from the kitchen's warmth. "No, thank you, Florence," Miss Marple replied, her voice gentle but firm. "But do tell me, have you heard anything of Mrs. Grayson's tea-tasting event?" Florence's eyes widened, her hands pausing on the tray. "Oh yes, Miss, it's all the talk at the grocer's. They say she's serving some foreign tea, worth more than gold, some reckon. Mrs. Phipps at the post office says it's from a secret recipe, guarded like a king's ransom, and there's to be important folk there, not just our lot." She hesitated, then added, "They say Mrs. Grayson's got a past, miss, something about her husband and trouble abroad." Miss Marple nodded, her expression neutral. "Gossip travels faster than truth, Florence. But I shall see for myself tomorrow evening." As Florence retreated, Miss Marple returned to the letter, her fingers tracing the wax seal. The crest was unfamiliar, its design intricate, a coiled serpent entwined around a teacup, its head raised as if to strike. It was an odd choice, she thought, more suited to a tale of adventure than a village soirée. Her mind, ever attuned to the nuances of human behavior, began to weave a tapestry of possibilities. Was the tea truly as rare as claimed, or was it a pretext for something else? And why invite her, a spinster with no apparent connection to the world of tea or trade? She settled back into her chair, her knitting forgotten, and allowed her thoughts to wander. Mrs. Grayson's letter had mentioned her late husband, Arthur Grayson, a man who had spent years in Darjeeling, amassing a fortune in the tea trade. His death, the letter implied, had been sudden, though no details were given. Miss Marple knew better than to trust such omissions. In her experience, what was left unsaid often spoke louder than words. She recalled a conversation with Mrs. Bantry, her old friend, who had mentioned a rumor of foul play surrounding Arthur Grayson's demise. The details were vague, something about a dispute with a rival trader, but Miss Marple filed it away. A thread to be tugged later. The clock on the mantel struck 5, its chimes soft but insistent. Miss Marple glanced at it, then at the invitation. The soirée was set for the following evening at 7 o'clock, an hour that suggested a formal affair. She would need to prepare, not just in dress, but in mind. Her years in St. Mary Mead had taught her that even the most innocuous gatherings could conceal currents of ambition, envy, or fear. She had seen it in the church bazaars, the garden parties, the quiet suppers where a misplaced word or glance revealed more than intended. And something in Mrs. Grayson's invitation, certain flourish, perhaps, or the choice of words, suggested that this tea-tasting would be no ordinary event. She rose again, this time to fetch her writing desk. Her response to Mrs. Grayson would be polite, gracious, and non-committal, as was her way. She dipped her pen in ink and began to write, her hand steady. Her words carefully chosen. Dear Mrs. Grayson, I am delighted to accept your kind invitation to the tea-tasting soiree at Grayson Manor. I look forward to sampling the Darjeeling Moonlight and to the pleasure of your company. Yours sincerely, Jane Marple. She sealed the letter with a plain wax disc, issuing ostentation, and placed it on the hall table for Florence to post. As she did so, her gaze fell on a small photograph on the mantel, a faded image of her nephew, Raymond, taken during his days as a young writer. Raymond had once teased her about her village sleuthing, as he called it, but he had come to respect her quiet acumen. She wondered what he would make of this invitation, with its promise of rare tea and veiled secrets. The evening passed quietly, as evenings in St. Mary Mead often did. Miss Marple dined alone, her meal simple but satisfying: a slice of cold ham, a boiled egg, and a salad of greens from her garden. She read a chapter of Trollope, her mind only half on the page, then retired early, her thoughts still turning over the invitation. Sleep came slowly, her dreams threaded with images of distant hills, tea plantations, and a silver caddy that gleamed like moonlight. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the air carrying the scent of fallen leaves. Miss Marple rose early, as was her habit, and tended to her roses, her fingers brushing against the velvety petals as she considered her approach to the soiree. She would observe, as always, letting others reveal themselves through their words and silences. Her wardrobe presented no great dilemma. She chose a black dress, its severity softened by a lace collar, and her favorite brooch, a cameo that had belonged to her mother. It was understated, like herself, but carried a quiet dignity as the day progressed. The village buzzed with speculation about the tea tasting. At the bakery, Miss Marple overheard Mrs. Price, the vicar's wife, discussing the event with a mixture of excitement and suspicion. They say the tea's worth a fortune, Mrs. Price said, her voice low. But why all the fuss? And why invite Miss Marple, of all people? No offense, of course, she added hastily, catching sight of Miss Marple in the doorway. None taken, Miss Marple replied with a smile. I expect Mrs. Grayson simply wishes to share her hospitality. Mrs. Price nodded, unconvinced, and Miss Marple left with a loaf of fresh bread, her mind noting the undercurrent of unease in the village. By afternoon, she had learned that the guest list included Dr. Lionel Hayworth, a botanist who had once lectured at the village hall on rare plants, Miss Clara Vance, a journalist whose sharp pen had stirred controversy in the county, and Mr. Rupert Klein, a tea merchant whose business dealings was said to be precarious. The inclusion of Lucy Grayson, Mrs. Grayson's niece, was expected, but her presence added another layer to the puzzle. Why such a disparate group, and what tied them to the Darjeeling Moonlight? As the hour of the soiree approached, Miss Marple prepared to depart. She walked to Grayson Manor, her steps measured, her umbrella tucked under her arm in case of an evening shower. The manor loomed ahead, its stone facade softened by ivy, its windows glowing with warm light. The gravel drive crunched underfoot, and she paused to admire the gardens, their borders meticulously tended. A faint scent of jasmine lingered in the air, mingling with something sharper, almost medicinal. She filed the observation away, her senses attuned to every detail. At the door, a maid in a starched apron greeted her, taking her umbrella with a curtsy. The hall was grand, its walls adorned with portraits of stern-faced ancestors. their eyes seeming to follow her as she was led to the drawing room. The room was a study in elegance. A chandelier sparkled above, its crystals catching the firelight. A long table was set with fine china, each cup bearing the same serpentine teacup crest as the invitation's seal. Mrs. Elspeth Grayson stood at the far end, her presence commanding. She was tall, her dark hair swept into an elaborate chignon, her dress a deep emerald that shimmered in the light. Her smile was warm, but Miss Marple noted a tightness around her eyes, a hint of strain beneath the polished exterior. "Miss Marple, how delightful that you could come," Mrs. Grayson said, her voice smooth but with a faint edge, as if she were performing for an unseen audience. "I trust you are curious about our little gathering." "Very much so," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild. "Your invitation was most intriguing." Mrs. Grayson's smile widened, but it did not reach her eyes. "Then allow me to introduce you to our other guests." The room held the promised few. Dr. Hayworth, a wiry man with spectacles perched on a sharp nose, his fingers stained with ink. Miss Vance, her auburn hair pinned carelessly, her eyes darting as if cataloguing every detail. Mr. Klein, his suit slightly ill-fitting, his hands twisting a handkerchief. And Lucy Grayson, pale and silent, her fingers clutching a small reticule. Each nodded politely, but Miss Marple sensed an undercurrent of tension, as if they were actors in a play, each waiting for their cue. Mrs. Grayson gestured to the table, where a silver tea caddy gleamed, its surface engraved with the same cryptic crest. "The Darjeeling Moonlight," she announced, her voice carrying a note of reverence. "A blend unlike any other, crafted by my late husband. Its secret lies not just in its taste, but in its story, a story I shall share tonight." As the maid poured the tea, its aroma filled the room, rich and floral, with a hint of something unplaceable, almost otherworldly. Miss Marple accepted her cup, her eyes never leaving the caddy. She sipped, the flavor delicate yet complex, like a melody with hidden notes. The others drank as well, their reactions varied. Dr. Hayworth's eyes widened in appreciation. Miss Vance's lips curled in a knowing smile. Mr. Klein's hands trembled slightly, and Lucy stared into her cup as if it held a prophecy. Mrs. Grayson began to speak, her words carefully chosen, weaving a tale of her husband's travels in Darjeeling, of a hidden grove where the tea was harvested under moonlight, of a recipe passed down through generations. Yet Miss Marple, listening intently, noted omissions, gaps where names, dates, or details should have been. The story was polished, rehearsed, but it lacked the weight of truth. She glanced at the guests, their faces a study in contrasts, curiosity, skepticism, unease, and something darker lurking beneath. The evening wore on, the conversation turning to lighter matters, the weather, the village, the manners, restoration. But Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere, piecing together the fragments of what she had observed. The caddy, the crest, the strained smiles, the scent in the garden, all were threads in a tapestry she could not yet see. As the clock struck 9, Mrs. Grayson rose, promising a second pot of tea. She crossed to a side table, her movements graceful, and reached for the caddy. A sudden cry broke the silence. The caddy was gone. The room erupted in murmurs, the guests rising to search, their voices overlapping in confusion. The windows were locked, the door had not opened, yet the caddy had vanished as if by magic. Mrs. Grayson's face was pale, her hands clenched. "It's impossible," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It was here moments ago." Miss Marple remained seated, her cup still in hand, her eyes moving from face to face. The Darjeeling Moonlight, it seemed, was more than a tea. It was a catalyst, a spark that had ignited something hidden in this room. And as the guests argued and accused, she knew that the true mystery had only just begun. Chapter 2. The Gathering at Grayson Manor. The gravel drive of Grayson Manor crunched under Miss Jane Marple's sensible shoes as she approached the imposing stone facade, its ivy-clad walls glowing faintly in the twilight. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and late-blooming roses, with that same sharp, almost medicinal undertone she had noted the previous evening. She paused, her umbrella tucked neatly under her arm, and surveyed the manor with a discerning eye. The windows, tall and mullioned, reflected the fading light like mirrors, and the chimneys stood sentinel against the darkening sky. Grayson Manor was a house that seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for secrets to be uncovered. The maid who had greeted her the night before opened the heavy oak door, her starched apron rustling as she curtsied. "Good evening, Miss Marple," she said, her voice soft but with a hint of nervousness that Miss Marple noted at once. The hall was as grand as she remembered, its portraits gazing down with their unyielding stares, but tonight there was a subtle change, an atmosphere of anticipation tinged with unease. The maid led her to the drawing room, where the low hum of voices greeted her. The room was a vision of elegance, its chandelier casting prisms of light across the polished mahogany. Furniture. The long table was set with the same fine china, each cup bearing the serpent cup crest that had so intrigued Miss Marple. A fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth doing little to dispel the chill of tension that hung in the air. Mrs. Elspeth Grayson stood near the fireplace, her emerald dress replaced by a deep burgundy gown that seemed to absorb the light. Her face was composed, but her hands clasped tightly before her betrayed a flicker of agitation. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to return," Mrs. Grayson said, her voice smooth but carrying that same performative quality. "I trust you are as curious as I am to resolve last night's mystery." "Indeed, Mrs. Grayson," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild. "A vanishing tea caddy is most unusual. I look forward to learning more." Mrs. Grayson's smile was brief, her eyes darting to the other guests, who were already assembled. Miss Marple took her place at the table, her gaze moving methodically over the group. Dr. Lionel Hayworth stood by a bookcase, his spectacles glinting as he examined a leather-bound volume, though his fingers seemed more restless than purposeful. Miss Clara Vance sat near the window, her notebook open, her pen scratching furiously as she observed the room with a journalist's hunger. Mr. Rupert Clyne hovered near the tea table, his handkerchief now a crumpled ball in his hand, his eyes fixed on the empty space where the caddy had stood. And Lucy Grayson, pale as ever, sat in a corner, her reticule clutched like a lifeline, her gaze flitting nervously between her aunt and the door. The group was much as it had been the previous evening, yet Miss Marple sensed a shift. The shock of the caddy's disappearance had settled into something else, suspicion, perhaps, or fear. She noted the way Dr. Hayworth avoided Clara's sharp glances, the way Rupert Clyne's shoulders stiffened when Mrs. Grayson spoke, the way Lucy's fingers trembled as she adjusted her shawl. Each gesture, each silence, was a thread in the tapestry she was beginning to weave. Mrs. Grayson clapped her hands, a sharp sound that drew the room's attention. "My friends," she said, her voice carrying a forced cheer, "let us not allow last night's incident to overshadow our purpose. The Darjeeling Moonlight is more than a teat, is a legacy. Tonight, I hope to share more of its story, and perhaps, with your help, recover what was lost." She gestured to the maid, who brought forward a tray bearing a new pot of tea, not the Moonlight Miss Marple noted, but a more common blend, its aroma pleasant but unremarkable. The cups were filled, and the guests took their seats, though the air remained charged with unspoken questions. Miss Marple sipped her tea, its warmth a contrast to the cool calculation of her thoughts. She had spent the day reflecting on the caddy's disappearance, and her walk through the village had yielded fragments of information that now formed a pattern in her mind. Mrs. Grayson began to speak, her words painting a vivid picture of her late husband's adventures in Darjeeling. She spoke of mist-shrouded hills, of tea-pickers moving like shadows under moonlight, of a grove so hidden that only a select few knew its location. The Darjeeling Moonlight, she claimed, was the result of a unique plant, cultivated in secret and blended with a precision that bordered on alchemy. Her voice was captivating, her gestures graceful. Yet Miss Marple detected a rehearsed quality, as if the story were a performance meant to distract. Dr. Hayworth interrupted, his tone dry. "A fascinating tale, Mrs. Grayson, but you'll forgive my skepticism. As a botanist, I find it hard to believe such a plant could remain undocumented. Have you any proof of its existence?" Mrs. Grayson's smile tightened. "My husband's notes, Dr. Hayworth, are quite detailed, but they are private, as you might understand." Clara Vance looked up from her notebook, her eyes gleaming. "Private or not, Mrs. Grayson, a tea like that would make a fine story. Perhaps you'd share those notes with a journalist, for the right price, of course." The room bristled at her words, and Miss Marple noted the flash of anger in Mrs. Grayson's eyes. Rupert Clyne coughed nervously, his handkerchief now a sodden mess. "Surely, Miss Vance, this is a matter of taste, not commerce," he said, his voice unsteady. "The Moonlight was a treasure." Lucy said nothing, her eyes fixed on her cup, but Miss Marple saw her flinch at the mention of commerce. The girl knew something, she was certain, but fear held her tongue. The conversation turned to speculation about the caddy's fate, each guest offering theories that ranged from plausible to absurd. Dr. Hayworth suggested a servant's carelessness. Clara proposed a rival collector, and Rupert muttered about village thieves. Mrs. Grayson dismissed each idea with a wave of her hand, insisting the caddy's value made it a target for someone in the room. Miss Marple remained silent, her eyes moving from face to face. She recalled her morning's inquiries in the village. At the post office, Mrs. Phipps had mentioned a stranger seen near the manor 2 days prior, a man in a dark coat, his face obscured by a hat. The grocer, Mr. Tuttle, had spoken of Rupert Clyne's recent financial troubles, his tea business teetering on the edge of ruin, and old Tom, the manor's gardener, had hinted at late-night activity in the greenhouse, though he refused to elaborate. These fragments, like pieces of a jigsaw, were beginning to form a picture, though its edges remained blurred as the tea was replenished. Mrs. Grayson produced a small box, its surface inlaid with mother of pearl. "Since the caddy is lost," she said, "I thought you might appreciate a glimpse of its contents." She opened the box to reveal a small quantity of loose tea leaves, their color a deep, silvery green. The aroma was unmistakable, the same intoxicating scent of the Darjeeling Moonlight. The guests leaned forward, their curiosity piqued, but Miss Marple's attention was elsewhere. She had noticed a faint mark on the table where the caddy had stood, a smudge of wax, barely visible, as if something had been pressed against it. She rose, feigning interest in a painting above the fireplace, and examined the smudge more closely. It was fresh, its texture suggesting a seal or stamp, perhaps from the caddy itself. Her mind turned to the crest on the invitation, the serpent and teacup, and she wondered if the caddy bore a similar mark. Had someone tampered with it before its disappearance? The thought was interrupted by a sharp gasp from Lucy, who had spilled her tea, her hands shaking as she dabbed at the stain on her dress. "Clumsy girl," Mrs. Grayson said, her tone sharp but not unkind. "Do be careful, Lucy." Miss Marple returned to her seat, her mind racing. The wax smudge, Lucy's nervousness, the stranger in the village all were threads, but they needed weaving. She engaged Dr. Hayworth in conversation, drawing him out about his botanical work. He spoke eagerly of rare hybrids, his enthusiasm betraying a deeper interest in the moonlight's origins. Clara, meanwhile, pressed Mrs. Grayson for details of her husband's death, her questions pointed but cloaked in sympathy. Rupert Klein remained silent, his eyes fixed on the box of tea leaves, as if they held the key to his salvation. As the evening drew to a close, Mrs. Grayson announced her intention to search the manor thoroughly the next day. "The caddy cannot have gone far," she said, her voice firm, "and I trust you all will assist in its recovery." The guests murmured their agreement, though Miss Marple sensed reluctance in their tones. She took her leave, her mind a whirl of observations. The night was cool, the stars sharp against the velvet sky, and as she walked back to her cottage, she felt the weight of the mystery settle upon her. The Darjeeling Moonlight was no mere tea, and the caddy's disappearance was no simple theft. Someone in that room knew more than they admitted, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover the truth, one quiet thread at a time. Chapter 3. The Vanishing Act, the Drawing Room of Grayson Manor seemed to hold its breath as the realization of the missing tea caddy sank in. The fire in the hearth crackled, its light casting flickering shadows across the faces of the assembled guests, each one a study in shock, suspicion, or carefully masked unease. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her teacup untouched since Mrs. Grayson's cry had shattered the evening's fragile civility. The silver tea caddy, with its enigmatic serpentine teacup crest, had vanished from the table in the span of moments, though no one had left the room, and the heavy velvet curtains concealed windows locked tight against the autumn chill. Mrs. Elspeth Grayson stood by the side table, her burgundy gown a stark contrast to her pallor. Her hands, usually so poised, trembled as she gestured toward the empty space where the caddy had gleamed only minutes before. "This is impossible," she said, her voice sharp with a mixture of disbelief and indignation. "It was here. I placed it here myself. Someone must have taken it." The accusation hung in the air, heavy as the scent of the Darjeeling moonlight that still lingered from the first pot. Dr. Lionel Hayworth pushed his spectacles up his nose, his brow furrowed, as he scanned the room as if expecting the caddy to materialize from the shadows. "Surely, Mrs. Grayson, it's a mistake," he said, his tone measured but with a hint of condescension. "Perhaps the maid moved it." The maid, standing silently by the door, flushed at the suggestion, her eyes darting to Mrs. Grayson for reassurance. "I didn't touch it, sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was pouring the tea, same as always." Miss Clara Vance, her notebook now closed, leaned forward, her auburn hair catching the firelight. "A thief in our midst, then," she said, her tone laced with a journalist's relish for drama. "How thrilling, but how could anyone slip away with a silver caddy under our noses?" It's not exactly a pocket watch. Mr. Rupert Klein, his handkerchief, now a sodden knot, mopped his brow. This is dreadful, he muttered, his voice quavering. That caddy, it's priceless. The tea alone, worth a fortune. His eyes flicked nervously to Mrs. Grayson, then away as if he feared her gaze. Lucy Grayson, seated in her corner, seemed to shrink further into herself, her reticule clutched so tightly that her knuckles whitened. She said nothing, but Miss Marple noted the way her gaze lingered on the table, as if tracing the caddy's ghostly outline. The girl's silence was louder than any protest, and Miss Marple tucked the observation away, a thread to be woven later. Mrs. Grayson raised a hand, silencing the murmurs. "We must search the room," she declared, her voice regaining its authority. "It cannot have gone far. I insist, everyone, look around you." The guests complied, though their movements were hesitant, as if each feared what they might find or be found with. Dr. Hayworth peered under the table, his long fingers brushing the carpet. Clara Vance made a show of checking the window ledgers, though her eyes remained on the others, cataloguing their actions. Rupert Klein hovered near the tea tray, his hands fluttering uselessly, while Lucy remained seated, her eyes fixed on her lap. Miss Marple, however, did not move. She sat, her posture serene, her sharp blue eyes taking in every detail, the angle of the curtains, the placement of the chairs, the faint smudge of wax she had noticed earlier, now barely visible in the FIRELIGHT. As the search yielded nothing, Mrs. Grayson's composure faltered. "This is intolerable," she said, her voice rising. "The caddy was my husband's legacy, irreplaceable. Its contents, the Darjeeling Moonlight, were his life's work. Whoever took it will answer to me." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of polite concern. "Might I ask, Mrs. Grayson, about the caddy itself? You mentioned it was a family heirloom. Was it distinctive in any way beyond its engravings?" Mrs. Grayson hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if weighing how much to reveal. "It was silver, as you saw, with a crest, a serpent and teacup, designed by my husband. It had a certain mechanism, a lock of sorts, known only to me, but that is beside the point. It was here, and now it is gone." The mention of a lock intrigued Miss Marple. A caddy with a secret mechanism suggested more than mere ornamentation. She filed the detail away, her mind turning to the logistics of the theft. The room had one entrance, guarded by the maid, who swore she had seen no one leave. The windows were locked, their latches rusted from disuse. The guests had been seated, their attention on Mrs. Grayson's tale of the tea's origins, when she had stepped away to fetch the second pot. The interval had been brief to minutes. Perhaps 3, yet it had been enough. Dr. Hayworth cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the tension. "If I may, Mrs. Grayson, the caddy's value lies in the tea, does it not? Perhaps the thief was after the Darjeeling Moonlight itself. A sample could fetch a high price in certain circles." Clara Vance smirked, her pen tapping her notebook. "Or perhaps it's the story behind it. You hinted at a secret, Mrs. Grayson. Care to elaborate? It might help us narrow down the motive." Mrs. Grayson's lips tightened, and Miss Marple noted the flash of unease in her eyes. "The tea's origins are no secret," she said sharply. "My husband discovered a unique plant in Darjeeling, a hybrid cultivated in a hidden grove. The details are complex and hardly relevant now." Miss Marple's thoughts quickened. A hybrid plant, a hidden grove, these were not mere embellishments, but clues to a larger truth. She recalled old Tom's mention of activity in the greenhouse, the disturbed earth she had seen in the garden. Could the caddy hold more than tea documents, perhaps, or a map to this mysterious grove? She glanced at Lucy, whose eyes were now fixed on her aunt, a flicker of fear in their depths. Rupert Clyne spoke up, his voice unsteady. "We should call the constable. This is theft, plain and simple. The village isn't safe if such things can happen under our noses." "Nonsense," Clara snapped, her tone dismissive. "A constable bumbling about will only muddy the waters. Besides, Mr. Clyne, you seem awfully eager to point fingers. Where were you when Mrs. Grayson stepped out?" Clyne flushed, his handkerchief twisting tighter. I was here, like everyone else. I didn't move." Miss Marple's voice, soft, but clear-cut through the rising tension. "If I may, Mrs. Grayson, could you describe the moment you noticed the caddy was gone? Every detail, however small, might help." Mrs. Grayson nodded, her hands smoothing her gown as if to steady herself. "I had finished telling you all about the tea's origins. I went to the sideboard to prepare the second pot there, by the window. The caddy was on the table, in plain view. I turned my back for a moment, no more, to fetch the kettle from the maid. When I returned, it was gone, and no one approached the table in that time." Miss Marple asked, her tone gentle but probing. "No one," Mrs. Grayson said firmly. "I would have seen them." The maid nodded in agreement, though her eyes darted nervously to the floor. Miss Marple made a mental note of her unease, wondering if the girl had seen something she dared not mention. The guests began to speculate again, their voices overlapping, but Miss Marple's attention returned to the table. The wax smudge was still there, faint but unmistakable. She leaned closer, feigning a need to adjust her shawl, and saw that it was not just wax, but a residue, perhaps from a seal pressed firmly against the wood. The caddy's lock, she thought, had it been tampered with before it vanished. She straightened, her mind racing through possibilities. A theft in a locked room, with all eyes on the table, suggested either extraordinary cunning or an accomplice. She glanced at the guests, each absorbed in their own thoughts. Dr. Hayworth's botanical knowledge made him a candidate, but his demeanor was too academic, too detached. Clara's ambition was clear, but her boldness seemed ill-suited to stealth. Rupert Clyne's nervousness hinted at desperation, perhaps financial, but he lacked the nerve for such a bold act. And Lucy, her fear suggested knowledge, not guilt, as if she were caught in a web knot of her making. Mrs. Grayson clapped her hands again, her voice firm. "Enough speculation. We will search the manor tomorrow, thoroughly. For tonight, I suggest we retire. This has been unsettling." The guests murmured their assent, though none seemed eager to leave. Miss Marple rose, her movements slow, her eyes lingering on the room's details, the heavy curtains, the polished floor, the faint scent of wax and tea. As she took her leave, she paused by the sideboard, her fingers brushing the smudge once more. It was a clue, small but significant, and she knew it would lead her closer to the truth. Outside, the night was still, the stars hidden by a veil of clouds. Miss Marple walked home, her umbrella tapping the ground, her mind a whirl of threads, waiting to be woven. The vanishing caddy was no mere theft, it was a spark, igniting secrets that had lain dormant in Grayson Manor, and Miss Marple, with her quiet patience, was determined to unravel them all. Chapter 4. Whispers of Motivet, drawing room of Grayson Manor. Though still grand in its chandelier-lit splendor, seemed diminished by the events of the previous evening. The absence of the silver tea caddy left an almost palpable void, as if the room itself mourned its loss. Miss Jane Marple sat in her accustomed chair, her hands resting lightly on her lap, her teacup cradled but barely sipped. The fire in the hearth burned low, casting long shadows that danced across the faces of the guests, each of whom bore the strain of suspicion in their eyes. The air was thick with unspoken questions, and Miss Marple, ever the observer, let her gaze drift from one to another, noting the subtle tells that betrayed their thoughts. Mrs. Elspeth Grayson stood near the fireplace, her burgundy gown replaced by one of deep navy, its severity accentuating the pallor of her face. She spoke little, her hands clasped tightly before her, but her eyes moved restlessly, as if searching for answers in the room's ornate corners. Dr. Lionel Hayworth, his spectacles glinting in the firelight, stood by the bookcase, his fingers tracing the spine of a volume on botany, though his attention seemed elsewhere. Miss Clara Vance, her notebook open once more, scribbled with a fervour that suggested she was capturing more than mere pleasantries. Mr. Rupert Klein sat hunched, his handkerchief now a tattered relic, his eyes darting to the door as if expecting an escape. And Lucy Grayson, her reticule abandoned on the table, sat with her hands folded tightly, her gaze fixed on the carpet, a picture of quiet distress. The conversation, such as it was, revolved around the caddy's disappearance, though it lacked the urgency of the previous night. Mrs. Grayson had announced her intention to search the manor at dawn, and the guests had been invited to assist, a request that carried the weight of an obligation. Miss Marple, however, had spent the morning in the village, her gentle inquiries yielding fragments of information that now formed a delicate web in her mind. She sipped her tea, a plain Assam, its ordinariness a stark contrast to the vanished Darjeeling Moonlight, and let the others speak, their words revealing more than they intended. Dr. Hayworth broke the silence, his voice dry and precise. Mrs. Grayson, you mentioned the caddy's lock last night, a mechanism, you said. Could it be that the thief knew how to open it? That might explain why they targeted it specifically. Mrs. Grayson's lips tightened, a flicker of unease crossing her face. The lock was my husband's design, she said, her tone clipped. A simple catch, but not easily undone by strangers. I cannot imagine how anyone here could have known its workings. Clara Vance looked up, her pen pausing. Not easily undone, perhaps, but not impossible. Secrets have a way of slipping out, Mrs. Grayson, especially when there's money to be made. Her smile was sharp, almost predatory, and Miss Marple noted the way Mrs. Grayson's hands clenched at the insinuation. Money is a crude motive. Miss Vance, Mrs. Grayson replied, her voice cold. The Darjeeling Moonlight was my husband's legacy, not a commodity to be bartered. Rupert Klein shifted uncomfortably, his voice barely above a murmur. Still, it's a valuable blend. I've heard rumors in the trade, they say. It's not just the tea, but something more, a formula, perhaps. Something that could change the market. His eyes flicked to Mrs. Grayson, then away, as if he regretted speaking. Lucy's head jerked up at his words, her eyes wide with something akin to panic. She opened her mouth, then closed it, her hands twisting in her lap. Miss Marple's attention sharpened. The girl's reaction was not one of surprise, but of fear, as if Klein's words had touched a nerve. She made a mental note, her thoughts returning to the village gossip she had gathered that morning at the bakery. Mrs. Price had spoken of a letter received by Mrs. Grayson, delivered by a man who lingered too long at the manor's gate. The postmistress, Mrs. Phipps, had mentioned Clara Vance's inquiries about Arthur Grayson's death, her questions probing into matters of inheritance and debts. And old Tom, the gardener, had let slip a curious detail, a patch of earth near the greenhouse, freshly turned, as if someone had been digging in the night. These fragments, combined with the wax smudge on the table and the caddy's hidden lock, suggested a motive far deeper than theft, for theft's sake. Miss Marple sat, her cup down, her voice soft but clear. "Mrs. Grayson, you spoke of the tea's origins, a hidden grove, a unique plant. Could the caddy have contained something beyond the tea itself? A document, perhaps, or a key to its source?" The room stilled, the guests turning to her with varying degrees of surprise. Mrs. Grayson's eyes narrowed, but she answered with measured calm. "The caddy held only the tea, Miss Marple. Its value lay in the blend and the heirloom itself, an object of sentimental worth." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite acceptance, though she was unconvinced. The caddy's lock, the wax smudge, the rumors of a formula pointed to something more tangible, something worth stealing in a room full of witnesses. She turned her attention to Clara, whose pen had resumed its scratching. "Miss Vance, you seem well informed about the tea trade. Have you heard anything of this formula Mr. Klein mentioned?" Clara's smile was sly, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of being center stage. "Oh, whispers, Miss Marple. The trade is full of them. Arthur Grayson was said to have crossed paths with some unsavory types in India, traders, botanists, even smugglers. They say he found something extraordinary, a plant that could yield a fortune. But he died before he could capitalize on it. Convenient, don't you think?" Her gaze flicked to Mrs. Grayson, who stiffened but said nothing. Dr. Hayworth adjusted his spectacles, his tone skeptical. "A fortune from a plant? Preposterous. No single hybrid could command such value without rigorous study. I'd need to see its properties myself to believe it." "And yet," Miss Marple said gently, "you were quite taken with the tea's flavor last night. Dr. Hayworth, you remarked on its uniqueness." Hayworth flushed, caught off guard. "A matter of taste, nothing more. Botanically speaking, it's unlikely to be revolutionary." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her mind noting his defensiveness. She turned to Rupert Klein, whose hands were now still, though his face was pale. "Mr. Klein, you mentioned the tea's value in the trade. Have you dealt with such rare blends before?" Klein swallowed, his voice hoarse. "Not directly, no, but I knew Arthur Grayson years ago. He spoke of the moonlight as if it were more than tea. A legacy, he called it, like Mrs. Grayson said. I hoped it might help my business if I could secure a sample." His words faltered, and he looked down, as if ashamed of his candor. Lucy's hands tightened in her lap, and Miss Marple's gaze softened as she addressed her. "Miss Grayson, you seem troubled. Is there something you'd like to share? Even the smallest detail might help." Lucy's eyes darted to her aunt, then back to her hands. I don't know anything," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's just, the caddy was important to Uncle Arthur. He said it held his dreams." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over the guests. Mrs. Grayson's expression softened, but only for a moment before it hardened again. "Lucy, that's enough," she said, her tone sharp. "We're here to find the caddy, not to indulge in sentiment." Miss Marple's mind raced, piecing together the fragments. The caddy's lock, the wax smudge, the rumors of a formula. Lucy's fear, the disturbed earth in the gardenal, pointed to a motive rooted not in the tea's flavour, but in its origins. She recalled a conversation with her nephew Raymond, who had once described the tea trade as a world of greed and betrayal, where fortunes were made and lost on the smallest secrets. The Darjeeling Moonlight, it seemed, was such a secret, and someone in this room was desperate to possess it. As the guests prepared to leave for the evening, Mrs. Grayson reiterated her plan for the morning's search. "We will comb every inch of the manor," she said, her voice resolute. "The caddy will be found, and the thief exposed." Miss Marple rose, her movements slow and deliberate. "A thorough plan, Mrs. Grayson," she said. "I shall be here to assist." Her eyes lingered on the table, where the wax smudge remained, a silent witness to the night's events. As she stepped into the cool night air, her umbrella tapping the gravel, she felt the threads of the mystery tightening. The caddy's disappearance was no mere theft, it was a move in a larger game, one she was determined to unravel, one quiet observation at a time. Chapter 5. The Gardener's Tale. The morning sun cast a golden haze over the gardens of Grayson Manor, where dew clung to the petals of late roses and the air carried the earthy scent of turned soil. Miss Jane Marple, her black dress softened by a lavender shawl, walked slowly along the gravel paths, her umbrella serving as a cane rather than a shield against rain. The manor loomed behind her, its windows catching the light like watchful eyes, but her attention was drawn to the gardens, where secrets seemed to linger in the shadows of the yew hedges. She had risen early, her mind restless with the events of the past 2 evenings, and had decided to explore the grounds before the planned search of the manor began. The gardens were a marvel, their borders meticulously tended with exotic blooms that hinted at Mrs. Grayson's wealth and her late husband's travels. Yet Miss Marple's sharp eyes noticed details others might overlook. A patch of disturbed earth near the greenhouse, its surface uneven as if hastily smoothed. A faint trail of crushed grass leading to a side gate, and that persistent medicinal scent, sharper here than in the manor's drive. She paused by a bed of chrysanthemums, her fingers brushing the leaves, her thoughts weaving the threads of the mystery, the wax smudge, Lucy's fear, the caddy's lock, and the rumours of a hidden formula. Her reverie was interrupted by the creak of a wheelbarrow, and she turned to see old Tom, the manor's gardener, trundling toward her. He was a wiry man, his face weathered like the bark of the oaks that lined the estate, his cap pulled low over eyes that missed little. Miss Marple had known him for years, a man of few words but deep loyalty to the manor, even through its changing hands. She smiled, her expression warm but calculated, knowing that gardeners often saw more than they let on. "Good morning, Tom," she said, her voice gentle. "The gardens are looking splendid. Mrs. Grayson must be pleased with your work." Tom touched his cap, his eyes crinkling with a hint of pride. "Mornin', Miss Marple. She's particular about her flowers. Mrs. Grayson likes exotic, like her husband used to bring back from his travels." His tone was neutral, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of wariness in his gaze, as if he weighed each word. She nodded, her eyes drifting to the greenhouse, its glass panes glinting in the sun. "I imagine you've seen many changes here, Tom. The manor has a way of collecting stories, doesn't it?" Tom's hands paused on the wheelbarrow's handles, his knuckles knotted with age. "Stories? Argy? And secrets, too, miss. This place has buried deep, like roots you don't see till you dig." He hesitated, then added, "Been queer goings-on lately, if you don't mind me saying." Miss Marple's interest sharpened, though her Tone remained light. Queer wings on. Do tell, Tom. I'm all ears for a bit of village news. Tom glanced toward the manor, ensuring they were alone, then lowered his voice. Before Mrs. Grayson came, there were folk about strangers. Not from St. Mary Mead, men in dark coats poking round the greenhouse at odd hours. I saw M late one night, token low. Couldn't hear much, but one mentioned the blend's true source. Sounded like trouble to me. Miss Marple's mind quickened, the phrase echoing Rupert Klein's mention of a formula. The blend's true source, she repeated softly. Did you see their faces, Tom, or hear anything else? Tom shook his head, his cap casting a shadow over his eyes. Too dark, miss. But they weren't locals, that's sure. And Mrs. Grayson heard her arguing with someone, maybe a month back, near the greenhouse. A man's voice, sharp like, talking about payment and what's owed didn't sound friendly. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts racing. The greenhouse, the disturbed earth, the strangers these were no coincidence. She gestured toward the patch of uneven soil she had noticed earlier. That spot there, Tom looks freshly turned. Ben. Planting something new. Tom's eyes followed her gaze, and a frown creased his brow. Not me, miss. That's been meddled with, and not by my hand. Noticed it 2 days ago, same day as the tea party. Thought it was rabbits, but don't look like rabbits now, does it? Miss Marple knelt, her movements careful, and examined the soil. It was loose, as if someone had dug and covered their tracks in haste. A faint glint caught her arduous sliver of metal, half buried. She brushed the dirt aside, revealing a small, tarnished key, its head engraved with a tiny serpent. Her heart quickened, but she kept her expression neutral as she slipped the key into her pocket, her shawl concealing the movement. Curious, she said, rising. Perhaps it's nothing, Tom, but I'd keep an eye on that patch. You never know what might turn up. Tom nodded, his face grim. I miss. I'll watch, but there's something not right here. That tea caddy going missing, it's stirred things up, like poking a hornet's nest. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her mind already weaving the key into the tapestry of Clouster wax smudge. The caddy's lock, Lucy's fear, and now this talk of strangers and arguments. Thank you, Tom, she said. You've been most helpful. If you see anything else, you know where to find me. As Tom trundled off, his wheelbarrow creaking, Miss Marple turned toward the greenhouse, its glass walls shimmering like a mirage. She approached cautiously, her eyes scanning for further signs of disturbance. The door was ajar, a faint scent of damp earth and that medicinal temps escaping into the morning air. Inside, the air was humid, the shelves lined with exotic plant orchids, ferns, and others she could not name. She noted a workbench in the corner, its surface cluttered with tools, pots, and a small notebook, its pages dog-eared. She resisted, the urge to examine it, knowing Mrs. Grayson's search would soon bring others to the greenhouse instead. She stepped outside, her gaze returning to the disturbed earth. The key in her pocket felt heavy, its significance unclear but undeniable. Was it linked to the caddy's lock, or something else entirely? She recalled Mrs. Grayson's insistence that the caddy held only tea, yet Lucy's words about her uncle's dreams suggested otherwise. The greenhouse, the strangers, the formula, these were pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Marple sensed they were connected to Arthur Grayson's death in ways yet to be revealed. As she made her way back to the manor, the crunch of gravel announced the arrival of the other guests, Dr. Hayworth, his coat dusted with pollen, was already examining the garden borders, his curiosity thinly veiled as botanical interest. Clara Vance strode purposefully, her notebook tucked under her arm, her eyes scanning the grounds as if hunting a headline. Rupert Clyne trailed behind, his face pale, his hands empty of his usual handkerchief, as if he had given up the pretense of composure. Lucy emerged last, her steps hesitant, her eyes avoiding the greenhouse as if it held a spectre. Mrs. Grayson appeared at the manor's door, her navy gown stark against the pale stone. "Miss Marple," she called, her voice carrying a note of command. "We're about to begin the search. Will you join us?" "Of course," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild. "I wouldn't miss it." As she followed the group inside, her fingers brushed the key in her pocket, its cold metal a reminder of the secrets buried in Grayson Manor's gardens. The caddy's disappearance was no isolated act, it was a thread in a larger web, one spun from greed, betrayal, and perhaps something darker. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet determination. She would follow that thread, wherever it led, one careful step at a time. Chapter 6. A clue in the ashes. The morning search of Grayson Manor had yielded nothing but frayed tempers and guarded glances, and by midday the guests had retreated to the drawing room, where a pall of frustration hung as heavily as the scent of yesterday's tea. Miss Jane Marple sat near the fireplace, her lavender shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, her hands folded in her lap as she observed the others with her customary quiet scrutiny. The chandelier above cast its prisms across the room, but the lights seemed dimmed by the weight of the unresolved mystery. The silver tea caddy, with its serpentine teacup crest, remained elusive, and the tension among the group had sharpened into something almost tangible. Mrs. Elspeth Grayson stood by the window, her navy gown absorbing the pale sunlight, her posture rigid as she surveyed the gardens where the search had begun. Dr. Lionel Hayworth paced near the bookcase, his spectacles slipping down his nose as he muttered about the improbability of a theft in a locked room. Miss Clara Vance, her notebook now a fixture, scribbled with a ferocity that suggested she was crafting a story rather than recording facts. Mr. Rupert Clyne sat slumped in a chair, his hands empty for once, his eyes fixed on the empty space where the caddy had stood. Lucy Grayson, her reticule forgotten, hovered near the door, her face pale and her fingers twisting the hem of her sleeve. Miss Marple's attention, however, was drawn to the fireplace, where the embers of last night's fire glowed faintly, a thin wisp of smoke curling upward. She had noticed, during the search, a faint scent of burnt paper mingling with the woodsmaker detail, overlooked by the others in their haste to scour the manor's nooks and crannies. Rising with the pretext of warming her hands, she approached the hearth, her eyes scanning the ashes. The grate was cold, but the scent lingered, sharp and distinct, suggesting something more than kindling had been consumed. She knelt, her movements deliberate, and sifted through the ashes with a small poker, her shawl shielding her actions from the room's prying eyes. Her fingers brushed against a fragment of paper, its edges charred but its surface intact enough to reveal a few words in a hurried script. Darjeeling, betrayal, payment. The handwriting was unfamiliar, its loops and flourishes suggesting urgency rather than elegance. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face remained serene as she slipped the fragment into her pocket, alongside the tarnished key she had found in the garden. Straightening, she turned to the group, her voice soft but clear. "Mrs. Grayson, did you burn any papers last night? The fireplace seems to have seen recent use." Mrs. Grayson's head snapped toward her, a flicker of surprise crossing her face before she smoothed it away. Papers? No, Miss Marple. The fire was lit for warmth, nothing more. The maid tends to it daily. The maid, hovering near the tea tray, nodded quickly, though her eyes darted to the floor. Miss Marple noted the girl's unease, a mirror of Lucy's nervous demeanor. She returned to her seat, her mind weaving the new clue into the tapestry of the mystery. The words Darjeeling, betrayal, payment to goad, old Tom's tale of an argument near the greenhouse, of strangers speaking of the blend's true source. The caddy's disappearance, she sensed, was not about the tea, but about what it concealed as secret worth burning evidence to protect. Clara Vance's voice cut through the silence, her tone sharp with curiosity. Burnt papers, Miss Marple. Now that's interesting. Perhaps someone was covering their tracks. Mrs. Grayson, any enemies your husband might have left behind. Someone who'd want that caddy for more than its silver. Mrs. Grayson's lips tightened, her hands clenching at her sides. My husband's affairs were complex, Miss Vance, but I assure you, his enemies are not in this room. The caddy was taken for its value, nothing more. Dr. Hayworth snorted, adjusting his spectacles. Value, yes, but botanical value. I'd wager the tea's uniqueness lies in a hybrid, as I've said. If that caddy held notes on its cultivation, it could be worth a fortune to the right buyer. Rupert Klein stirred, his voice low and hesitant. A fortune, yes, I heard Arthur Grayson speak of a formula once, years ago, not just the tea, but how it was made. He said it was his legacy, locked away safe. His eyes flicked to Mrs. Grayson, then dropped, as if he feared he had said too much. Lucy's hands froze on her sleeve, her breath catching audibly. Miss Marple's gaze softened as she addressed her. Miss Grayson, you mentioned your uncle's dreams being tied to the caddy. Did he ever speak of papers, perhaps, or something hidden within it? Lucy's eyes widened, her voice barely a whisper. He said it was important, that it held more than tea. But I don't know what, I swear. Her gaze darted to her aunt, who gave her a sharp look that silenced her. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle understanding, though her thoughts were racing. The fragment in her pocket, the key, the wax smudge on the table all pointed to a caddy that was more than a vessel for tea. She recalled her nephew Raymond's tales of the tea trade, where secrets of cultivation could spark rivalries as fierce as any feud. The burnt paper suggested someone had acted swiftly to destroy evidence, perhaps in the chaotic moments after the caddy's disappearance, as the guests resumed their speculation. Miss Marple's mind turned to the mechanics of the theft. The room had been locked, the maid at the door, the guests seated. Yet the caddy had vanished in the brief interval when Mrs. Grayson stepped to the sideboard. The wax smudge, she reasoned, might have come from a seal on the caddy's lock, pressed too firmly in haste, and the burnt paper had been slipped into the fire during the confusion, when all eyes were on the empty table. She glanced at Dr. Hayworth, whose botanical expertise made him a candidate for interest in a formula, though his academic detachment seemed genuine. Clara's probing questions suggested ambition, but her boldness was too overt for stealth. Rupert's desperation hinted at financial motives, yet his nervousness lacked the cunning required. Lucy's fear, however, was different, not guilt, but knowledge, as if she were caught in a web spun by others. Mrs. Grayson clapped her hands, her voice cutting through the murmurs. Enough talk. We will continue the search this afternoon. Every room, every corner. The caddy will be found. Miss Marple rose, her movements slow, her eyes lingering on the fireplace. "A wise plan, Mrs. Grayson," she said. "I shall return to assist." As she stepped into the hall, the fragment of paper in her pocket seemed to burn with its own heat. The words, Darjeeling, betrayal, payment, were a whisper of motive, a clue to a truth hidden in the ashes of Grayson Manor. She would follow that whisper with her quiet patience until the mystery unraveled. Chapter 7. The journalist's discovery. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of Grayson Manor, casting long shadows across the drawing room where the air was thick with the residue of suspicion and the faint, lingering scent of burnt paper. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual chair, her lavender shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, her hands folded as she observed the gathered guests with her quiet, penetrating gaze. The morning's search had yielded no trace of the silver tea. Caddy, and the tension among the group had grown taut, like a thread stretched to its breaking point. The fire in the hearth had been relit, its crackle a soft counterpoint to the strained voices that filled the room. Mrs. Elspeth Grayson stood by the sideboard, her navy gown replaced by one of charcoal grey, its starkness mirroring her mood. Her hands moved restlessly, adjusting a vase of lilies as if to impose order on the chaos of the mystery. Dr. Lionel Hayworth leaned against the bookcase, his spectacles glinting as he thumbed through a botanical journal, though his eyes darted to the others with a scholar's curiosity. Mr. Rupert Klein sat hunched, his hands now empty of his tattered handkerchief, his face etched with worry. Lucy Grayson, her reticule reclaimed, clutched it tightly, her eyes fixed on the floor as if it held answers she dared not voice. And Miss Clara Vance, her auburn hair catching the sunlight, stood apart, her notebook closed but her expression alive with the thrill of discovery. It was Clara who broke the silence, her voice sharp and deliberate, cutting through the room like a blade. "Miss Marple," she said, turning to face the older woman, "you've been awfully quiet. Found any more clues in the ashes?" Her tone was teasing, but her eyes were keen, as if she sensed Miss Marple's quiet probing. Miss Marple smiled, faintly, her expression serene. "The ashes were revealing, Miss Vance, but I suspect you've uncovered something of your own. You've been busy with that notebook of yours." Clara's lips curled into a sly smile, and she stepped forward, her movements confident. "As a matter of fact, I have. I've been digging into Arthur Grayson's past call, in professional curiosity, and I've found something that might interest you all." She paused for effect, her gaze sweeping the room, lingering on Mrs. Grayson, whose hands froze on the vase. "Go on, Miss Vance," Mrs. Grayson said, her voice cold but controlled. "What have you found?" Clara opened her notebook, flipping to a marked page with a flourish. Arthur Grayson wasn't just a tea merchant. He was a gambler in the trade, playing fast and loose with powerful men in Darjeeling. "I spoke to a contact in London, a retired trader who knew him. Seems Arthur swindled a plantation owner, a man named Sanjay Rowe, out of a rare plant. The Darjeeling Moonlight isn't just a blend, it's made from a hybrid, one that Rowe claimed as his own. Arthur's death wasn't an accident, or so the whispers go. Rowe vowed revenge, and now that Caddy's gone missing, convenient, isn't it?" The room stilled, the weight of her words settling like dust. Mrs. Grayson's face paled, her hands clenching the vase until her knuckles whitened. "That's slander, Miss Vance," she said, her voice trembling with barely suppressed anger. "My husband's death was a tragedy, not a conspiracy, and this Rowe has no claim to anything here." Dr. Hayworth adjusted his spectacles, his tone skeptical, A hybrid plant, you say. Intriguing, but hardly proof of foul play. Botanical disputes are common in the trade, Miss Vance. You're spinning a story, not facts. Clara's eyes flashed. Facts. I've got more. Rowe was seen in London last month, asking about Grayson's widow. And then there's the matter. Of the caddy's lock, Mrs. Grayson, you said it was your husband's design. Care to tell us what it was hiding? A formula, perhaps, or proof of his dealings with Rowe? Lucy gasped, her reticule slipping to the floor, and Miss Marple noted the girl's wide-eyed panic. Rupert Klein shifted uncomfortably, his voice low. This is dangerous talk, Miss Vance. Stirring up old grudges won't find the caddy. Miss Marple's voice, soft but clear, cut through the rising tension. Miss Vance, your inquiries are most illuminating. But tell me, did your contact mention anything about papers? Documents that might have been kept with the tea? Clara hesitated, her confidence faltering for a moment. Not directly, but he said Arthur was obsessive about his notes, always scribbling in a little book. If that caddy had a hidden compartment, it might have held something like that. Map, maybe, or a recipe for the moonlight. Miss Marple's thoughts quickened, the burnt paper fragment in her pocket. Darjeeling. Betrayal, payment taking on new significance. She recalled the tarnished key from the garden, its serpent engraving matching the caddy's crest. Could it unlock a compartment, revealing notes that Clara's story suggested? She glanced at Mrs. Grayson, whose composure was fraying, her eyes darting to Lucy as if to silence her unspoken thoughts. Before Miss Marple could press further, a commotion interrupted. The maid entered, her face flushed, holding a telegram. For you, ma'am, she said, handing it to Mrs. Grayson. The room watched as Mrs. Grayson tore it open, her expression darkening as she read. Without a word, she crumpled the paper and tossed it toward the fire, though it missed, landing on the hearth. Miss Marple's eyes followed the paper, her mind noting its potential significance. Troubling news, Mrs. Grayson, she asked gently. Nothing of consequence, Mrs. Grayson snapped, but her voice betrayed a tremor. A business matter, unrelated to this. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite concern, though she resolved to retrieve the telegram later. Clara's discovery had stirred the room, exposing fault lines in Mrs. Grayson's carefully curated Farcart. The mention of Sanjay Rowe, the swindled plantation owner, echoed old Tom's tale of strangers near the greenhouse, and the burnt paper's words betrayal, payment suggested a debt unpaid. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the caddy, its lock, and the key in her pocket. Was it the key to a compartment, or to something larger, secret worth stealing, burning, or killing for? As the guests dispersed to resume the search, Clara lingered, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's with a spark of recognition. You're onto something, aren't you? She said, her voice low. I can tell. Care to share? Miss Marple smiled faintly. I'm merely an old woman with a fondness for puzzles, Miss Vance. But your story has given me much to think about. Clara smirked, unconvinced, and strode off, her notebook under her arm. Miss Marple waited until the room emptied, then approached. The hearth, her movements slow, she retrieved the crumpled telegram, smoothing it carefully. The words were brief but telling. Rowe arrives tomorrow, demands caddy. Be cautious. Her heart quickened, but she slipped the paper into her pocket, her face serene. The journalist's discovery had cast a new light on the mystery, linking the caddy to a past of betrayal and revenge. Miss Marple felt the threads tightening. Story, the burnt paper, the the key, the greenhouse's secrets. The caddy's disappearance was no simple theft. It was a move in a game of shadows, and she was determined to follow its trail, one quiet clue at a time. Chapter 8. The merchant's nervous confession. Late afternoon light filtered through the drawing-room windows of Grayson Manor, casting a muted glow over the polished mahogany and the tense faces of its occupants. The air was heavy with the scent of lilies and the undercurrent of suspicion that had grown sharper with each passing hour. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual chair, her lavender shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, her hands folded calmly, though her sharp blue eyes missed nothing. The fruitless search for the silver tea caddy had stretched into the afternoon, and the guests, weary from scouring the manor's endless rooms, had reconvened with little to show but frayed nerves and guarded glances. Mrs. Elspeth Grayson stood by the fireplace, her charcoal gown a somber contrast to the room's elegance, her posture rigid as she surveyed the group with barely concealed impatience. Dr. Lionel Hayworth, his spectacles fogged from the exertion of the search, leafed through a botanical journal, though his fingers betrayed a restless energy. Miss Clara Vance, her notebook now a constant companion, sat with a predatory gleam in her eyes, as if the mystery itself were her prey. Lucy Grayson, her reticule clutched tightly, seemed to shrink into her chair, her face pale and her eyes darting to the door. And Mr. Rupert Klein, his usual handkerchief absent, fidgeted with the cuff of his sleeve, his face a mask of anxiety that drew Miss Marple's attention like a beacon. The room was silent save for the soft crackle of the fire, until Rupert Klein's voice, thin and unsteady, broke the stillness. "Miss Marple," he said, his eyes fixed on the carpet, "might I have a word? In private, if you please." The request was unexpected, and the others turned, their curiosity piqued. Lips tightened, but she nodded curtly. "The library is empty, Mr. Klein. You may use it." Miss Marple rose, her movements slow and deliberate, and followed Klein to the library, a smaller room lined with leather-bound volumes and heavy drapes. The air was cooler here, tinged with the musty scent of old books. Klein closed the door behind them, his hands trembling as he turned to face her. I need to tell you something," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper, "about the caddy and Arthur Grayson." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her expression one of gentle encouragement. "Go on, Mr. Klein, I'm listening." Klein paced, his steps uneven, his fingers twisting the cuff of his sleeve. "I knew Arthur years ago, in the tea trade. He was ambitious, always chasing the next big thing. He came to me once, said he'd found something extraordinary there. Darjeeling Moonlight. Promised me exclusive rights to sell it, said it'd save my business." He paused, his face palling. "I was struggling then, debts piling up. I agreed, put everything into it, but Arthur, he backed out. Said the blend wasn't ready, that it was too valuable to share. I lost everything." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind was sharp, weaving his words into the tapestry of clusy burnt paper, the tarnished key, Clara's tale of betrayal. "That must have been difficult, Mr. Klein. Did you come to St. Mary Mead hoping to reclaim that opportunity?" Klein nodded, his eyes glistening. "When I heard Elspeth had the caddy, I thought maybe she'd honor his promise. I came to the soiree to ask her, to beg if I had to. But then it vanished, and he stopped, his voice breaking. I swear, Miss Marple, I didn't take it. But I think Lucy knows something. She was so nervous, always watching the caddy, like she was afraid of it. Miss Marple tilted her head, her voice gentle but probing. Afraid of it? Did you see her do anything unusual that night? Klein hesitated, his hands clenching. Not exactly. But when Elspeth stepped away to fetch the second pot, Lucy's eyes were on the caddy, not her aunt. And later, when it was gone, she looked relieved, almost, like she'd been waiting for it to happen. Miss Marple's thoughts quickened, recalling Lucy's fear, her cryptic words about her uncle's dreams. The key in her pocket, the burnt papers, words, Darjeeling, betrayal. Payment and, now Klein's confession, painted a picture of a caddy that held more than tea, a secret tied to Arthur Grayson's broken promises. She leaned forward slightly. Mr. Klein, did Arthur ever mention a formula or papers kept with the caddy? Klein's eyes widened, then dropped. He hinted at it, said the Moonlight's secret was locked away, safe from rivals. I thought he meant the recipe, but he was cagey, like he didn't trust me, or anyone. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The caddy's lock, the key, the telegram warning of Sanjay Rao's arrival, pointed to a secret worth stealing, worth burning evidence to conceal. Klein's desperation made him a suspect, yet his candor suggested fear rather than guilt. She rose, her voice calm. Thank you, Mr. Klein. You've been most forthcoming. I suggest you keep this between us. For now. Klein nodded, his relief palpable, though his hands still trembled. As they returned to the drawing room, Miss Marple's eyes swept the group, noting Clara's sharp glance as if she sensed a story unfolding, and Lucy's hunched shoulders, as if the weight of her knowledge was crushing her. Mrs. Grayson announced the search would resume after tea, her voice firm but strained, and the guests dispersed to refresh themselves. Miss Marple lingered, her gaze returning to the fireplace, where the ashes of the burnt paper lay hidden. Klein's confession had added a new thread to the mystery. Arthur's broken promise, Lucy's fear, the caddy's secret. She thought of her nephew Raymond, who had once described the tea trade as a world of greed and hidden stakes. The Darjeeling Moonlight was no mere blend. It was a legacy of betrayal, and someone in this room was desperate to claim it. With the key in her pocket and the telegram's warning in her mind, Miss Marple felt the web tightening, and she was determined to trace its strands, one quiet confession at a time. Chapter 9. Lucy's secret. The late afternoon light had softened into a golden haze, bathing Miss Jane Marple's cottage in St. Mary Mead with a warmth that belied the chill of the mystery unfolding at Grayson Manor. Inside, the drawing room was a haven of quiet order, with its lace curtains, polished oak table, and the soft click of Miss Marple's knitting needles, now set aside. She had invited Lucy Grayson for tea. Sensing the girl's nervous demeanor, held a key to the vanishing tea caddy. And now they sat across from each other, a delicate china teapot steaming between them. The air carried the faint scent of Earl Grey, but Miss Marple's attention was fixed on Lucy, whose pale hands clutched her cup as if it were an anchor. Lucy Grayson, with her slight frame and wide, anxious eyes, seemed out of place in the cozy room, her grey dress blending into the shadows. Her reticule, a constant companion at the manor, lay forgotten on the table, its clasp undone as if she had no strength left to guard it. Miss Marple poured the tea, her movements deliberate, her voice gentle but laced with the quiet authority that invited trust. You seem troubled, my dear, she said, passing a cup to Lucy. The events at the manor have been unsettling, I'm sure. Would you like to share what's on your mind? Lucy's fingers trembled, the cup clinking softly. against its saucer. She glanced at the door, as if expecting her aunt's formidable presence, then back to Miss Marple, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. I don't know where to begin," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's all so frightening. The caddy, the tea. It's more than Aunt Elspeth says." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her expression one of kind concern, though her mind was sharp. Weaving Lucy's words into the tapestry of Cluse the tarnished key, the burnt paper, Rupert Cline's confession, and Clara's tale of betrayal. "Go on, Lucy," she said softly. "Whatever it is, you're safe here." Lucy's composure crumbled, her words spilling out in a rush. "The caddy, it wasn't just for the tea. Uncle Arthur showed it to me once, years ago, before he died. It had a secret compartment, hidden under the base. He said it held a map to where the Darjeeling Moonlight came from, a grove in India no one else knew about. He made me promise not to tell, not even Aunt Elspeth." Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained serene. A secret compartment, a map piece, confirmed her suspicions that the caddy's value lay beyond its silver and tea. She recalled the wax smudge on the table, the key with its serpent engraving, and the burnt papers, cryptic words, Darjeeling, betrayal, payment. "That's a heavy burden for you to carry, my dear," she said gently. "Did you ever see this map?" Lucy shook her head, her hands dropping to her lap. "No, but I saw him open the compartment once. It was clever, hidden so you'd never know unless he showed you. After he died, Aunt Elspeth kept the caddy locked away, but she never mentioned the map. I thought maybe she didn't know. But at the soiree, when it vanished, I was so afraid. I hid it, Miss Marple, in the greenhouse, under a floorboard. I thought it would be safe, but when I checked the next morning, it was gone." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet intensity, though her voice remained calm. "You hid the caddy. Why, Lucy?" Lucy's tears spilled over, her words choked. "I heard Aunt Elspeth arguing with someone, a man, weeks ago, outside the greenhouse, late at night. He was angry, talking about the map, saying it belonged to him, that Uncle Arthur had stolen it. I didn't see his face, but I was scared. I thought if the caddy was gone, no one could find the map, and it would all stop." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts racing. Lucy's confession tied the threads together. The greenhouse's disturbed earth, old Tom's tale of strangers, the telegram warning of Sanjay Rao's arrival. The caddy's disappearance was no theft, but a desperate act by a frightened girl, only for someone else to claim it from its hiding place. "You did what you thought was right," she said, her tone soothing. "But tell me, Lucy, did you tell anyone where you hid it?" "No," Lucy whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "I swear I didn't, but someone must have seen me, or known about the compartment. I don't understand how." Miss Marple's mind turned to the key in her pocket, its serpent matching the caddy's crest. Had someone else known of the compartment, perhaps even possessed another key? She recalled Clara's probing questions about Arthur's dealings, Rupert's desperate hope for the tea's value, and Dr. Hayworth's interest in its botanical origins. Each had a motive, but Lucy's fear pointed to an outsider, perhaps the man from the greenhouse argument, Sanjay Rao, whose name loomed in Clara's story and the telegram. She poured Lucy another cup of tea, her movements steady. "You've been very brave, my dear, but you mustn't carry this alone. Have you spoken to your aunt about the map?" Lucy shook her head vehemently. She'd be furious. She thinks the caddy's just a keepsake, but I know she's hiding something too. She's been so secretive since Uncle Arthur died. Always checking the locks, always watching the servants. I think she's afraid of someone. Miss Marple's thoughts quickened. The telegram's warning row arrives tomorrow. Demands caddy taking on new weight. She recalled her nephew Raymond's tales of the tea trade's darker side, where secrets of cultivation could spark vendettas across continents. The map, she sensed, was the key to the Darjeeling Moonlight's source. A prize worth stealing, worth burning papers to conceal. "You've done well to tell me, Lucy," she said. "I'll keep your confidence, but we must be careful. Someone else knows more than they let on." As Lucy sipped her tea, her trembling easing, Miss Marple's mind wove the threads tied to the key, the burnt paper, the greenhouse, the map. Lucy's secret had shifted the mystery's shape, revealing a caddy that was a Pandora's box of hidden truths. She would return to the manor, watch the guests, and wait for the arrival of Sanjay Rowe, whose shadow loomed ever larger. With her quiet patience, she would unravel the web, one fragile thread at a time. Chapter 10. The Greenhouse Revelation. The sun dipped low over Grayson Manor, casting long shadows across the gardens, where the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and fading roses. Miss Jane Marple, her lavender shawl draped over her shoulders, moved with quiet purpose along the gravel path toward the greenhouse, its glass panes glinting like a beacon in the twilight. The day's search had yielded no trace of the silver tea caddy, and the guests had retreated to the manor, their voices muted by exhaustion and suspicion. But Miss Marple's mind was alight with Lucy's confession, the tarnished key in her pocket, and the burnt papers, cryptic words, Darjeeling, betrayal, payment. She had slipped away under the pretense of admiring Mrs. Grayson's roses, determined to investigate the greenhouse where Lucy had hidden the caddy. The greenhouse stood apart from the manor, its structure a delicate lattice of iron and glass, its interior a humid world of exotic plants and shadowed corners. Miss Marple paused at the door, her eyes scanning the surroundings for signs of disturbance. The patch of turned earth, noted earlier by old Tom, lay undisturbed, but a faint trail of crushed grass led to the greenhouse's entrance, as if someone had passed through recently. The medicinal scent she had detected before was stronger here, mingling with the earthy aroma of soil and leaves. She pushed the door open, its hinges creaking softly, and stepped inside. The air was warm and heavy, the shelves lined with orchids, ferns, and strange silvery plants that seemed to shimmer in the fading light. A workbench in the corner held gardening tools, pots, and a dog-eared notebook, its pages yellowed. Miss Marple's gaze fell on the floor, where a loose floorboard caught her eye, its edge slightly raised, as if it had been lifted and replaced in haste. Lucy's words echoed in her mind. "I hid it in the greenhouse, under a floorboard." She knelt, her movements careful, and pried the board loose with a trowel from the workbench. Beneath it, in a shallow hollow, lay a small vial of seeds. There. Surface a peculiar silvery green, labeled in a spidery hand, Moonlight Hybrid. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained serene. The seeds were no ordinary find. They were the heart of the Darjeeling Moonlight's secret, the hybrid plant Clara Vance had mentioned, the legacy Arthur Grayson had guarded. She slipped the vial into her pocket alongside the key and the burnt paper fragment, her mind weaving the clues together. The caddy's map, Lucy had said, led to a hidden grove. These seeds were its living proof, a treasure worth stealing, worth burning evidence to conceal. She rose, her eyes scanning the greenhouse for further signs. The notebook on the workbench beckoned, but footsteps on the gravel outside halted her. She stepped behind a row of ferns, her shawl blending with the shadows. As the door creaked open, Dr. Lionel Hayworth entered, his spectacles glinting as he moved to the workbench, his fingers brushing the notebook with a botanist's reverence. He opened it, scanning the pages, his lips moving silently as if reading a revelation. Miss Marple watched, her breath steady, noting the intensity in his posture, the way his hands trembled slightly. Hayworth's muttering was faint but audible, hybrid. Extraordinary. If only I'd known. He closed the notebook abruptly, tucking it under his coat, and left as quickly as he'd come, unaware of Miss Marple's presence. She emerged from her hiding place, her mind racing. Hayworth's interest in the notebook confirmed his fascination with the moonlight's botanical origins. But was he seeking the seeds, or merely knowledge? The notebook, she suspected, held Arthur Grayson's notes, perhaps the formula Rupert Klein had mentioned, or details of the map Lucy had described. Miss Marple examined the floorboard again, ensuring no other clues remained. The soil beneath was undisturbed, but a faint scratch on the wood suggested the caddy had been placed there, then removed. Someone had followed Lucy's trail, claiming the caddy before the search began. The key in her pocket, with its serpent engraving, felt heavier now perhaps. It unlocked the caddy's hidden compartment, or another secret tied to the seeds. As she left the greenhouse, the twilight deepened, the manor's windows glowing like eyes in the dusk. She recalled the telegram's warning row, arrives tomorrow, and Clara's tale of Sanjay Row, the plantation owner wronged by Arthur Grayson. The seeds, the map, the caddy's disappearance, all pointed to a legacy of betrayal, with Row as its shadow. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to her nephew Raymond, who had spoken of the tea trade's ruthless undercurrents, where a single plant could spark fortunes or feuds. The Moonlight hybrid was such a plant, and someone perhaps in the manor, perhaps approaching, was determined to claim it. She returned to the manor, her steps measured, her umbrella tapping the gravel. The guests were gathered in the drawing room, their voices low, their faces etched with suspicion. Mrs. Grayson's eyes narrowed as Miss Marple entered, as if sensing her quiet purpose. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice sharp, "you've been in the gardens again. Any discoveries?" "Only the beauty of your roses, Mrs. Grayson," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild. "But I trust the search will soon bear fruit." Her eyes met Lucy's, who looked away, her fear palpable. Dr. Hayworth's hand rested on his coat, where the notebook was hidden, and Clara's pen scratched relentlessly, as if chasing a headline. Rupert Klein's gaze was fixed on the floor, his desperation a silent plea. Miss Marple felt the threads of the mystery tightening: the seeds, the key, the burnt paper, the map. The greenhouse had revealed a truth, but the caddy's whereabouts, and the hands that claimed it, remained elusive. With Sanjay Rao's arrival looming, she knew time was short, and she would follow the threads, one quiet revelation at a time. Chapter 11. The unexpected visitor. The evening shadows deepened over Grayson Manor, cloaking its stone facade in a veil of mystery as the wind whispered through the ancient oaks. Inside, the drawing room was a tableau of strained civility, the chandelier's light casting uneasy flickers across the faces of the guests, who had gathered once more after a fruitless day of searching for the silver tea caddy. Miss Jane Marple sat in her accustomed chair, her lavender shawl neatly draped, her hands folded with deceptive calm. Her sharp blue eyes, however, were alert, weaving together the threads of the mystery the tarnished key, the burnt paper, the vial of seeds, and Lucy's confession of the caddy's hidden map. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and the weight of secrets. Yet to be uncovered, Mrs. Elspeth Grayson stood by the fireplace, her charcoal gown a stark silhouette against the flames, her composure a fragile mask over her mounting agitation. Dr. Lionel Hayworth, his spectacles reflecting the firelight, clutched the botanical journal he had taken from the greenhouse, his fingers betraying a nervous energy. Miss Clara Vance, her notebook open, scribbled with a journalist's seal, her eyes darting as if sensing a story about to break. Mr. Rupert Klein, his desperation now a quiet resignation, sat with his hands clasped, his gaze fixed on the empty table where the caddy had once stood. Lucy Grayson, her reticule forgotten, hovered near the window, her pale face etched with fear, as if she anticipated a storm beyond the glass. The silence was shattered by a sharp knock at the manor's front door, echoing through the hall like a summons. The maid, her face flushed, hurried to answer, and moments later, a stranger entered the drawing room, his presence as abrupt as a thunderclap. He was tall, his dark eyes sharp under a high forehead, his tailored coat marked with the dust of travel. His faint Indian accent carried a note of authority as he introduced himself. "I am Sanjay Rao," he said, his gaze sweeping the room, lingering on Mrs. Grayson. "I have come for what is rightfully mine, the tea caddy, and all it contains." Mrs. Grayson's face drained of color, her hands clenching at her sides. "Mr. Rowe," she said, her voice tight, "you are not welcome here. The caddy is gone, as you must know. This is no time for your claims." Rowe's smile was thin, his eyes unyielding. "Gone? How convenient, Mrs. Grayson. My family's honor was stolen by your husband, along with the secret of the Moonlight hybrid. That caddy holds proof a map to the grove that was ours. I will not leave without it." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. The telegram's warning Rowe arrives tomorrow had come a day early, and Rowe's words confirmed Clara's tale of betrayal and Lucy's secret about the map. She noted the reactions around the room. Dr. Hayworth's eyes widened behind his spectacles, as if piecing together a botanical puzzle. Clara's pen paused, her face alight with the thrill of a scoop. Rupert Klein shrank back, his hands trembling, and Lucy's breath caught, her eyes darting to Miss Marple as if pleading for rescue. Clara's voice cut through the tension, sharp and eager. "Mr. Rowe, you're saying Arthur Grayson stole from you? That's quite a claim. Care to share details?" For the record, her pen hovered, ready to capture every word. Rowe's gaze flicked to her, cold and dismissive. "This is no story for your papers, miss. It is a matter of justice. Arthur Grayson took our hybrid, our livelihood, and hid its source in that caddy. I have waited years to reclaim it." Dr. Hayworth cleared his throat, his tone academic but curious. "A hybrid, you say? If it's as unique as claimed, it would be a botanical marvel. But a map, surely the plant itself is the prize." Rowe's eyes narrowed. "The plant is nothing without its source. The grove is hidden, its location known only through the map. Without it, the Moonlight hybrid cannot be cultivated." Miss Marple's thoughts raced, the vial of seeds in her pocket a silent weight. The map, she realized, was the key to replicating the hybrid, and the seeds were its proof. She recalled the greenhouse's disturbed earth, the notebook Hayworth had taken, and the key with its serpent engraving. Rowe's arrival was no coincidence. Someone had tipped him off, Perhaps the same person who had taken the caddy from Lucy's hiding place. She spoke, her voice soft but clear. "Mr. Rowe, you seem certain the caddy holds this map. Have you seen it, or do you rely on rumors?" Rowe's gaze met hers, sharp and assessing. "I know what Arthur Grayson was capable of, miss. He boasted of the caddy's secrets to my father before the betrayal. I need no rumors to know its value." Mrs. Grayson's voice was icy. "Enough. You have no proof, and the caddy is gone. Leave my home, Mr. Rowe, or I shall call the constable." Rowe's smile was unyielding. "Call him if you wish. I will search this manor myself if I must." Miss Marple noted the tension in the room, each guest a player in a game of hidden motives. Lucy's fear suggested she knew of Rowe's claim. Hayworth's interest hinted at botanical ambition. Clara's eagerness pointed to a story worth risking all. And Rupert's silence spoke of a man caught in a web of his own debts. She felt the threads of the mystery tightening the seeds, the key, the burnt paper, the map, and now Rowe, a figure from a past of betrayal, as Rowe turned to leave, promising to return. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on Mrs. Grayson, whose composure was a fragile mask. The unexpected visitor had shifted the game, exposing stakes higher than a stolen caddy. With the vial of seeds in her pocket and Rowe's threat echoing, Miss Marple knew the truth was close, and she would follow its trail, one quiet observation at a time. Chapter 12. The twist unraveled. The drawing room of Grayson Manor was a crucible of tension, its chandelier casting fractured light across the faces of the gathered guests, each a study in guarded anticipation. The fire in the hearth crackled, its warmth doing little to dispel the chill of suspicion that had settled over the room since Sanjay roused abrupt departure. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual chair, her lavender shawl draped neatly, her hands folded with serene composure, though her sharp blue eyes gleamed with the quiet intensity of a mind piecing together a complex puzzle. The silver tea caddy's disappearance, Lucy's confession, the vial of seeds, the tarnished key, the burnt paper, and Rowe's claim had woven a web of secrets, and Miss Marple sensed the moment had come to unravel its threads. Mrs. Elspeth Grayson stood by the fireplace, her charcoal gown a stark silhouette, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles whitened. Dr. Lionel Hayworth, his spectacles glinting, clutched the botanical notebook he had taken from the greenhouse, his fingers betraying a nervous energy. Miss Clara Vance, her notebook open, scribbled with a journalist's hunger, her eyes darting as if sensing a revelation. Mr. Rupert Klein sat slumped, his face pale, his desperation now a quiet resignation. Lucy Grayson, her reticule abandoned, stood near the window, her eyes wide with fear, as if the manor itself were closing in. Miss Marple rose, her movements slow and deliberate, her voice soft but commanding attention. "Mrs. Grayson, if I may, I believe we are close to understanding the caddy's fate. But first, I'd like to clarify a few matters." Her gaze swept the room, noting each guest's reaction, Clara's pen pausing, Hayworth's spectacles slipping, Klein's hands clenching, Lucy's breath catching, and Mrs. Grayson's eyes narrowing. She continued, her tone measured. "The caddy, as we know, held more than the Darjeeling Moonlight. Lucy, you bravely shared that it concealed a map to a hidden grove, the source of the Moonlight hybrid. The seeds I found in the greenhouse confirm this a rare plant, the key to a fortune." She produced the vial of silvery green seeds, holding it up to the firelight, its contents glinting like a promise. Lucy gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, while Mrs. Grayson's face paled. Where did you find those? She demanded, her voice sharp. In the greenhouse, under a floorboard, Miss Marple replied, her eyes never leaving Mrs. Grayson's, where Lucy hid the caddy before someone else claimed it. But let us consider the sequence of events. The caddy vanished during the soiree in a locked room with all eyes on the table. Yet Lucy had already hidden it, fearing its secrets. Someone knew of her actions or the caddy's value and retrieved it from the greenhouse. Clara leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. Someone in this room, you mean? Who's your bet, Miss Marple? Miss Marple's smile was faint. Patience, Miss Vance. Let us examine the motives. Dr. Hayworth, your interest in the moonlights. Botanical origins is clear. You took a notebook from the greenhouse, perhaps seeking Arthur Grayson's notes on the hybrid. Hayworth flushed, his hand tightening on the journal, but he said nothing. Miss Vance, she continued, your pursuit of a story led you to Sanjay Rao's claims of betrayal, suggesting the caddy held proof of Arthur's misdeeds. A scoop. Worth stealing for, perhaps. Clara's smirk faltered, her pen still. Mr. Klein, Miss Marple said, turning to the merchant. Your debts and Arthur's broken promise gave you reason to covet the caddy's secrets, a chance to save your business. Klein's face crumpled, but he shook his head weakly. And Lucy, she said gently, your fear led you to hide the caddy, but not to steal it. Your knowledge of the map made you a witness, not a thief. Lucy's eyes filled with tears, her shoulders sagging with relief. Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Grayson, her voice steady. Which brings us to you, Mrs. Grayson. The caddy's lock, the burnt paper, the telegram warning of Rao's arrival all point to a deeper truth. You staged the caddy's disappearance, didn't you, to draw out Sanjay Rao, whom you suspect. Of your husband's murder? The room froze, the fires crackled the only sound. Mrs. Grayson's composure shattered, her hands trembling as she stepped forward. How dare you, she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple held up the burnt paper. Fragment, Darjeeling, betrayal, payment. This was a letter, wasn't it? One you burnt to conceal your plan. You knew Rao was coming, knew. He sought the map to reclaim his family's hybrid. You hid the caddy in the manor, in a hollowed-out book, to lure him here and expose him. Mrs. Grayson's eyes widened, then closed, her shoulders slumping. Yes, she admitted, her voice barely audible. I suspected Rao killed Arthur, poisoned him for the hybrid's secret. The caddy's map was my proof, but I couldn't risk him finding it. I hid it, staged the theft, to see if he'd reveal himself. Miss Marple nodded, producing the tarnished key. This, I believe, unlocks the caddy's compartment. I found it in the garden, where you dropped it in your haste. She paused, her gaze softening. But you underestimated Rao's determination, and the greed of others. The guests sat stunned, their motives laid bare. Miss Marple's quiet deductions had unraveled the twist, revealing a plot born of vengeance and fear. The caddy, she knew, was still in the manor, its map a key to a past of betrayal. With Rao's shadow looming, she felt the mystery's threads converging, one final revelation away from the truth. Chapter 13. The confrontation, the drawing room of Grayson Manor was steeped in a taut silence. The fire's glow casting restless shadows across the ornate walls as the weight of Miss Jane Marple's revelations settled over the guests. The chandeliers, prisms flickered, reflecting the tension that crackled like static in the air. Miss Marple stood near the fireplace, her lavender shawl a soft contrast to the gravity of her presence. the tarnished key and vial of seed still in her pocket. There. Significance now, a beacon guiding the mystery to its climax. The silver tea caddy, hidden by Mrs. Elspeth Grayson to lure Sanjay Rowe, was the linchpin of a plot woven from betrayal, and Miss Marple sensed the moment for truth had arrived. Mrs. Grayson, her charcoal gown stark against her pallor, stood rigid, her confession of staging the caddy's theft still echoing. Dr. Lionel Hayworth clutched his pilfered notebook, his spectacles glinting with unease. Miss Clara Vance, her pen stilled, watched with a journalist's hunger, sensing a story's crescendo. Mr. Rupert Klein, his desperation now a quiet dread, sat with hands clasped, eyes fixed on the floor. Lucy Grayson, freed from her secret, trembled near the window, her gaze darting to the door as if expecting an intrusion. Miss Marple's voice, soft but resolute, broke the stillness. Mrs. Grayson, you hid the caddy to draw out Mr. Rowe, believing he murdered your husband. But we must test this truth. I propose we retrieve the caddy from its hiding place, the hollowed-out book, in the library and invite Mr. Rowe to examine it. His reaction may reveal his intent. Mrs. Grayson's eyes widened, a mix of fear and resolve crossing her face. Very well, she said, her voice low. The caddy is in the library, as you guessed. But if Rowe is the killer, this is dangerous. Clara's eyes gleamed. Dangerous. That's a story worth writing. Let's see this through. Hayworth nodded, his curiosity outweighing caution, while Klein and Lucy remained silent, their fear palpable. Miss Marple had discreetly arranged for the village constable, Mr. Polk, to be nearby, sensing the confrontation might turn volatile. She led the group to the library, where Mrs. Grayson retrieved a heavy tome from a shelf, its spine embossed with gold. She opened it, revealing a hollowed compartment where the silver caddy gleamed, its serpentine teacup crest catching the light. Miss Marple produced the tarnished key, unlocking a hidden panel beneath the caddy's base, revealing a folded parchment map, its edges worn, marked with coordinates in Darjeeling's hills. Before the guests could react, the library door swung open and Sanjay Rowe strode in, his dark eyes blazing. So, it is true, he said, his voice sharp with triumph. The map my family's legacy, stolen by Arthur Grayson. Hand it over, Mrs. Grayson, or I will take it. Mrs. Grayson stepped back, clutching the caddy. You killed him, she accused, her voice trembling. For this map, for the hybrid, admit it. Rowe's smile was cold. Your husband was a thief, but I am no murderer. I came for what is mine. He lunged for the caddy, but Miss Marple's voice, calm and commanding, halted him. Mr. Rowe, she said, if you are innocent, you'll wait for the constable. The truth will out. Rowe hesitated, his eyes flicking to the map, then to the door. In a sudden move, he grabbed the caddy and bolted, but Constable Polk, alerted by Miss Marple's note, was waiting in the hall. A brief struggle ensued, and Rowe was restrained, his face a mask of fury and defeat. In the drawing room, with Rowe secured, Miss Marple pressed him. The burnt paper Darjeeling, betrayal, payment, was it yours? Did you demand the map as payment for Arthur's betrayal? Rowe's shoulders slumped, his voice low. Yes, I wrote to Arthur, demanding my family's share. He died before he could answer, poisoned, I believe, by a rival trader, not me. I came for the map, to reclaim the grove. Miss Marple nodded, the threads, aligning the seeds, the map, the key, the telegram. Rowe's confession cleared him of murder, but confirmed the caddy's value. Mrs. Grayson's staged theft had exposed the truth, but at a cost. The guests, stunned, watched as Polk led Roe away, the caddy and map secured as evidence. Miss Marple's eyes softened as she addressed Mrs. Grayson. You sought justice, but the truth is safer in the open. The map and seeds will tell their own story now. The confrontation had unraveled the mystery's heart, leaving only its echoes to linger in the manor's shadowed halls. Chapter 14. The Quiet Resolution. The drawing room of Grayson Manor, once a stage for suspicion and secrets, now held a stillness that spoke of closure, though the air still carried the faint scent of lilies and the weight of truths laid bare. The chandelier's light softened as dusk settled over St. Mary Mead, casting gentle shadows across the faces of the guests, who sat in a subdued circle, their roles in the drama of the silver tea caddy now fully exposed. Miss Jane Marple, her lavender shawl neatly draped, sat with her hands folded, her sharp blue eyes softened by a quiet satisfaction. The caddy, its hidden map, the vial of seeds, the tarnished key, and Sanjay-roused confrontation had woven the final threads of the mystery, and she felt the calm that comes when a puzzle is complete. Mrs. Elspeth Grayson stood by the fireplace, her charcoal gown softened by the evening light, her face a mix of relief and weariness. The revelation of her staged theft, meant to trap Roe, had left her exposed, yet unburdened. Dr. Lionel Hayworth, his botanical notebook now returned to the greenhouse, adjusted his spectacles, his curiosity sated, but his pride chastened. Miss Clara Vance, her notebook closed, sat with a rare stillness, her ambition tempered by the story's unexpected depth. Mr. Rupert Klein, his desperation eased by the truth, clasped his hands, his eyes no longer fleeing to the door. Lucy Grayson, freed from her secret, sat with a tentative calm, her reticule at rest, her fear replaced by a fragile hope. Miss Marple's voice, soft but clear, broke the silence. Mrs. Grayson, you sought justice for your husband, and though your methods were unconventional, they brought the truth to light. The caddy, the map, and the seeds have told their story. What will you do with them now? Mrs. Grayson's gaze settled on the caddy, now resting on the table, its serpentine teacup crest glinting faintly. I thought the caddy was my husband's legacy, she said, her voice low but steady. But it was a chain binding me to his past. The seeds, the map, they belong to no one now. I've decided to give them to the Royal Botanical Society. Let them study the Moonlight hybrid, make it a gift to the world, not a source of strife. Dr. Hayworth's eyes brightened, a spark of his old enthusiasm returning. A wise choice. Mrs. Grayson, the hybrid could advance botanical science, if properly studied. I'd be honored to assist, if permitted. Clara Vance leaned forward, her voice softer than usual. No story, then. No headline about betrayal and stolen fortunes. Mrs. Grayson's lips curved faintly. Write your story, Miss Vance, but let it be one of healing, not scandal. My husband's mistakes need no further airing. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts drifting to her nephew Raymond, who had once spoken of the tea trade's capacity for both greed and redemption. The Moonlight hybrid, once a spark for betrayal, would now serve a greater good. She glanced at Lucy, whose eyes met hers with a shy gratitude. And you, my dear, Miss Marple said gently, you've been brave. Your uncle's dreams are safe now, in their own way. Lucy's voice was small but clear. I just wanted it to stop the fear, the secrets. Thank you, Miss Marple. Rupert Klein cleared his throat, his voice hesitant. I hoped the tea would save me, but I see now it was never mine to claim. I'll find another way. Miss Marple's eyes softened, her mind noting the quiet shifts in each guest greed, giving way to humility, fear to resolution. The constable had taken Sanjay Rowe for questioning, his confession of seeking the map but not murder clearing the air, though his fate rested with the law. The caddy, its map, and the seeds were secured, their secrets no longer a danger as the guests prepared to leave. Mrs. Grayson approached Miss Marple, her expression one of grudging respect. You saw through it all, she said. I underestimated you. Miss Marple smiled faintly. People often do, Mrs. Grayson, but human nature is much the same in St. Mary Mead or Darjeeling. It tells its own story, if one listens. The guests departed, their footsteps fading into the night. Miss Marple walked home, her umbrella tapping the gravel, the stars bright above. The Darjeeling Moonlight, once a symbol of greed, was now a memory, its legacy entrusted to science. She thought of her cottage, her knitting, the quiet life that awaited her, and felt a quiet contentment. The mystery had unraveled, its threads woven into a tapestry of truth, and St. Mary Mead would sleep soundly tonight. The end.